Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Eric Chou. Based in the greater Seattle area, Eric is a network technologist who has worked on some of the biggest networks at some of the biggest companies in the industry, including Amazon AWS and Microsoft Azure. You can follow him on Twitter at Eric Chou, that's ERICCHOU, and check out his website at networkautomationnerds.com. And you can also find his Network Automation Nerd podcast at podcast.networkautomationnerds.com. Eric is the author of the LeanPub book, Kafka Up and Running for Network DevOps, Set Your Network Data in Motion. In the book, Eric shows you how to get the Apache Kafka data message system up and running, helping you to expand your network engineering toolbox. In this interview, we're going to talk about Eric's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a book author. So thank you very much, Eric, for being on the LeanPub Front Matter podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm a believer in the platform, so it's very nice to meet you over virtually, and it's good to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much for being on the podcast. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and the sort of curious way that you found your way into a career in network engineering.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Taiwan, and I immigrated to the US when I was 13. So that's roughly like 7th grade, 8th grade, and kind of staying here, got my education. That was in Southern California. And so, technically I started ESL, right? So that's for people who doesn't know, it's English as second language, typically for new immigrants coming in. That's where they'll start. So I've never thought I would be writing books in English. And so that was quite a jump, even though I've been in the country for longer than, in the US, longer than I was in Taiwan, but it's still, kind of language, something that, you're kind of emotionally connected. And especially when you're younger, if you're just kind of ingrained in yourself, your brain, that's how your brain functions, especially for such a different language than in like Chinese and English. So for a long time, I had to translate something I hear into Chinese, into my mind, then translate back and then respond. And gradually you kind of graduate into a state where you just respond naturally and intuitively. And on the flip side, that means your Chinese is progressively like decreasing in efficiency. So, I'm sorry, my peanut-sized brain just can't take two languages at the same time. And but anyways, yeah. So I grew up in Taiwan. I immigrated to the US. I studied business and finance back in college, so really far away from technology. Although, because I was in college during the kind of the later part of the dot-com bubble. I don't know if you remember, but it was circa 1996, 2000, where everything was just crazily overvaluated, and so I decided to say, okay, let's if this finance thing doesn't work out, then I'll do a minor in computer related field. Not knowing anything about it, I picked a field that is obsolete by now, which is like multimedia web design. And if you know this company Macromedia or Front Page, that sort of stuff, that's what it was, and that's quickly just got out of fashion, out of date. But it did give me the opportunity to go intern at a local ISP, an internet service provider at the time. And that's what got me into, I was in support. So that got me into like the kind of a broad view of customer service, how people connected to the internet. And, one thing led to another. I moved to a bigger ISP, launched some of these markets for cable broadband, and then, gradually into hardware. And as you mentioned, got into some of the top cloud providers in the early days, which was really eye-opening. And here I am, 20 years later, still haven't worked a day in finance, and just being a tech geek and a nerd. So that's kind of in a nutshell how it came about.
And so this, so people get a little bit of a sense of the kind of because your career, like what you do and your job changes so much over time throughout your career. Right?
Yeah.
You've been there for this really interesting. I mean, they've always pick any 20 years in the development of these kind of telephony, kind of data communication networks, and you'll find an interesting 20 years. But you've been here for sort of in the industry for a very interesting time, and you got into it at a very interesting time as well. And I just wanted to mention that this sort of like people from California who get into kind of network engineering and stuff like that from different paths. This has come up on this podcast a few different times with guests, and it's one guy. He speaking of multimedia, he ended up sitting on top of the Space Jam website.
Oh wow,
for Warner Brothers, and
nice.
that was because he was in LA or whatever, like, and that there's
Right.
this one thing, that one of the artifacts of this sort of history of the, when you think of the web, is that how big and how important California was. And often we say Silicon Valley, but it was like, this was a sort of a California thing back in, partly, and it was an experience that was shared by a lot of people. And to be, I mean, particularly, there'd be a lot of people who actually, maybe got their degree in the specific area that they wanted, that was hot, and then the dot-com bubble burst, and they were like, oh my God, now I've got to switch to something that I didn't study anyway. Um, so that leads me, before we get into the details of what you maybe did at your first job, and then talk about how that's changed
Sure.
over time, I was wondering if this is a version of a question that comes up all the time on the podcast, is if you were starting out now with the intention of having a career in the same area that you've had your career in, would you do a 4-year formal university degree or not?
Wow, that's a good question. Because I have two young daughters, and that's something that me and my wife talked about, right? It's college education still uh placed as much value as it does, right? Because in my opinion, let's just go back and say, what's the value of a college education, right? Because that's essentially what the question is. What kind of value does a 4-year degree give you? So I think first is branding, for sure. Like if you go to Ivy League, right? Like I have a Harvard MBA, Harvard degree, then that's branding, right? Somebody has evaluated you and make sure you meet all the criteria for that. So that's branding. You're associated with the good brand. And second is connection, right? That you met the people that perhaps that you were associated with later on in life. And the third is the technical knowledge that it gives you, whatever major you are, and that goes along with like life skills, like how to manage your time, how to not to oversleep and not to get drunk the night before a midterm, right? So those are the things that I think, three things that give you those value. And what I would say to that is, knowing what I do now, I think I will look back and think about whether I acquire those knowledge. So I didn't go to a Ivy League, college, right? So first, branding, that's out. I didn't really associate myself with, people whom I ended up working with, and that's kind of iffy, right? So, but that didn't pan out for me. So the third thing really is the technical knowledge, and I didn't even do that, like as we mentioned before. So I think I that's a 50-50 chance. And because I didn't grow up with a lot of money in the family, it took my mom basically all she had to just put me and my sister through college. So I probably would not have gone to college doing what I do now, knowing that I could still be disciplined enough to get to where I am. So most of what like I say, was web design, but I ended up in networking. So in order to get to a proficiency level, I have to do a lot of self-studying. And once I acquire enough, funding and kind of financial backing, I actually went back to a certificate program to study Python, and that is where like the coding part comes into play, and that is where the first book that came out and so on. So I think to circle back to your question, I probably would not have if I knew that I had the discipline to acquire those knowledge myself on my own. But that is a big issue, right? Then the question becomes, how do you know? And you just don't, unless you start going to do it. So yeah, for my own personal background, I probably wouldn't have done it. But having said that, I still put aside money in my 529 from the two kids. And if they decide to take a gap year, fine, right? But at the end of the day, I want to give them that opportunity. They don't have to take it, but they will have the option to go to college. And that is my approach now. Ask me, 2 years later, I might say something different. It's like, yeah, sorry, Junior, I had a good night in Vegas and it's all gone. So I guess you just have to get some scholarship.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. That's a really great, and that's a sort of a spontaneously structured answer, which is the best kind of answers in my view.
Nice. Yeah, I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, very much. I can say, just speaking from my own experience, having gone both to a non-brand name and to a brand name university, like, it has a powerful effect on you, not just on other people's perceptions of you, but on you yourself, to go to a brand name university. And
Yeah.
I mean, in my case, it was Oxford for my doctorate. One of the things about it that is very you can't help but think you deserve the special treatment
Oh wow,
for a
really?
while.
Okay, that's interesting.
I mean, I would say that's true. I'm definitely confess that's true of me, and I think it's true of basically everyone I know, that you just kind of, it's like anything, you kind of think you deserve it once you've got it. That
Hmm.
it's very easy to fall into that mental trap. And so, although going to like an Ivy League university or other kind of brand name university, it has this profound value that stays with you your whole life. At the
Yeah.
same time, if you want to be a good person and realistic about yourself, you do need to keep, just on that very specific stuff, you do need to keep a kind of, you need to have an inner voice going, this was largely accidental. And don't fall for the hierarchical stuff in like too much,
I think you should give yourself more credit for than that, of course, right? Like, I'm pretty sure there's some sort of little bit of entitlement, but also you do deserve it, right? It is a hard thing to achieve, and so you, just like anything else, you put a check mark next to it, and you move on. But I think you brought up a good point, is this time value of education, right? So if you had your education in your 20s, that means your payback period, your compounding period is a lot longer than somebody who got it in, say, their 40s, right? Nothing wrong with the time spent. It's just like these are all finite resources that you decide to spend your time on. Your opportunity cost is different. Like I said, I think the biggest issue is your compounding, right? Like if you've gone to this particular university and you could get 20-30% more in your base salary, stretch that over 20 years is very different than stretch that over 10 years or 20 or 15 years. So that's another good point where you brought up, about your investment.
Yeah, and it's as well. Yeah, no, that it's very interesting, that point about compounding, because one of the things I like to say about education is, like, true education is that, like, the kind of thing where you've spent years out of your life like focusing on reading and learning and things like that, is that it gives you a power that has to be possessed in order to be perceived.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why the idea of, like, that there's some kind of, like, I use the word again, like, hierarchy of people who are educated and people who aren't, is so ugly and ancient, right? Is just
Mm-hmm.
because you have to kind of have spent those years doing it to go until finally go, oh man, like, I see the world completely differently now. You know what I mean?
Right.
And you have you really do, if you've got the privilege to have the time and the resources to spend years in your youth in study, it stays with you forever. I don't know, do you know the movie Braveheart?
That was one of my favorite movie, man.
Okay.
Freedom.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite scenes in that is when Uncle Argyle is going to take young William Wallace off, and William Wallace, who's now been orphaned, right? He sees
Yeah.
his Uncle Argyle's awesome sword, and obviously he wants to learn how to fight. And Argyle pokes him in the forehead and says, "First, I'm going to teach you how to use this," meaning your
Mm-hmm.
mind, and then,
Right.
and he holds up the sword, "I'll teach you how to use this." And
Right.
there's this, like, it might seem that, like, spending years with your nose in books is not a very martial way to spend your time, but actually it is. So I guess we're getting maybe a little bit derailed there, but, like, talking about education is actually
No,
really
no,
important, important
it's
subject.
related, right? Because what you're doing with Lean Pub really is about democratizing education, and bringing that meritocracy up, just because you're eliminating the gatekeeper for publishing, which is awesome. And of course, I didn't know that about you liking Braveheart. And
Yeah.
I used to play around with my friends and just like trying to mimic, like an Asian guy trying to mimic like a Scottish accent. And so that's pretty funny. But it is one of my favorite movie, just because I think I just think I admire people who believe in something so firmly that they're willing to give their lives for it, and not just their life, their everything, right? So at a I think the movie came out, what, 95, or
that
it's like
sounds
some,
that sounds right. Yeah.
yeah, like 95 or so, and I think they won Best Picture, or at least nominated for it. So at a young impressionable age for me, looking at that movie, I'm just like, oh my god, I wish I could find something that I believe so much that I could dedicate my life and my whole being to it. Um, I don't think I'm still searching for that, but I admire people who have found that calling. And back to what you were saying about having the right mindset, having the right kind of discipline that kind of accumulates over time. And I think that's is also a very good value for it. And hopefully you start developing that while at a young age. So, you compound it further, because that's a macro skill that applies to everywhere.
Yeah, no, totally true. And it's that's also actually funny. That's sort of people often describe their experience sort of going out of high school into the military that way as well.
Yeah.
I learned how to be disciplined, and it's often like we often think of the sergeant barking at you, which I'm sure there's a lot of, but you're making a years long commitment when you do that in a much more serious way than sort of going to college, which you can drop out at any time if you just feel like it. And yeah, that learning, in addition to sort of like what I was talking about, my sort of like, romantic way of talking about the power of education, the power of discipline, and spending years disciplining yourself when you're young can have this compounding effect throughout your life as well. And so those are sort of twin kind of very important things to keep in mind when you're making those decisions when you're starting out. And so you started out, your first job that I see here on LinkedIn was for Time Warner Cable, starting in 2001. And I was wondering if you said you did a lot of learning, you had to do a lot of learning on your own, and I imagine on the job and things like that. So what was the kind of work you were doing as a network engineer in the early 2000s like? What did you do in a typical day?
Yeah, I think so. The first job I started was actually through a local ISP. But unfortunately, just like a lot of ISP back then, they were belly up, so they went bankrupt and no longer exist. So I think I had a hard time adding that. But in actuality, I started there. I want to give them credit. It's called Gus Networks. They gave me the start. As a young person who really didn't know what they were doing, I was able to make contribute and make significant, meaningful impact to their business, and that gave tremendous amount of kind of confidence to a young engineer, especially someone who did not study computer science or didn't come up the traditional way. So really, I would say it made a lot of difference working for Gus Networks. And so one of the things, I know you had other guests who went through like kind of a Cisco route, in particular, Nick Russo, and some of the books that he published on CCIE, CCDE. So I kind of went through the same route. So Cisco Systems provides this great certification path. And back then, Cisco was the way to know. I think at that time, they had something like a 70-80% market share for enterprise. And for service providers, a little lower, but still significant. So as long as you know Cisco, then you're probably guaranteed to get a shot at a job, right? But it may not be the highest position available. It may not be the job that you want, but that is kind of their path. So it was kind of an education, but it was like through a Cisco lens, and you get certified through that, right? So while working at the ISP, I got through the entry level, which was CCNA, like associate level. Then I had to go for the professional level, which was like 4 additional tests, which lends me enough credibility to land a job at Time Warner Cable. So Time Warner was also one of the big companies that gave me a large scale exposure. They were, I don't know if you remember, but 2001, that was kind of still a dial-up world, and broadband was just being rolling out. So DSL and cable modem were the kind of the two competing technologies that they were rolling out, and they were actually head to head, like they're really competing with each other to do the rollout, get enough coverage to cover, United States or England or so other developing areas. And so Time Warner Cable at the time, they were trying to convert their cable plant into cable broadband ready. And so they were looking for young engineers to kind of relocate to other areas that might not be as desirable. So even though I was in California, so California is kind of a interesting state by itself. It will probably be, I think last counted, was like the 8th largest economy in the world, even by itself, right? If you just separate it out. So they're very diverse. What you were talking, even relate back to what you were talking about earlier. So you have the Northern California, which is very tech focused, very, I don't know, hippie-ish, if you will, and the Southern California, which is a lot of media companies, a lot of diverse, different industries, and the middle part, which is very much agricultural and farming, that sort of stuff. So anyways, so in California, Time Warner Cable was looking for people to go to the desert and launch, it's the Palm Springs desert, to launch like the cable broadband. And it's not everybody wants to go live in the desert, but at the time I was brave enough to raise my hand even without ever being there. So I just went out and got the exposure into kind of my large scale networking exposure. And for people who doesn't know what network engineer do on a day-to-day basis, basically you gain your knowledge by doing more and more complex, larger, more scale out networks, and that's how you kind of build your street creds, right? Like, so you, of course, you study your books and you get your protocols and you get your exchanges, you'll get your book knowledge. But the way, at least at the time, without virtualization, without a lot of these lab stuff, the way that you gain your credibility and kind of apply those book knowledge is working on more complex and larger networks. And so that kind of stayed with me to go to Time Warner Cable, then eventually working on large scale data networks for Amazon in the early days. You get that hockey stick growth for Microsoft Azure, and sorry, you hear my Amazon assistant going in the background, but anyways. So yeah, so those are the stuff that I kind of got into, and kind of just stay with me.
And so would that be you, for example, like, when you were working for Time Warner and they got you this kind of, job in this sort of less desirable area, were you going to like a big, basically building and racking and stacking servers together and things like that? Like people might have seen, if they're not familiar with it, see in the movies, these big rows of, columns of basically computing machines.
Yeah, so it was even more basic than that. So, you see these servers, but these server needs to be connected somehow, right? And what I was doing was actually connecting residential areas for people. So instead of dial up, I mean, it sounds so ancient at this time, but it was actually at a time where people, when they need to get online, they need to plug in their phone line and dial into a service provider via your RJ11, and you see these modem count like so these counts were like kind of the last generation. And in order to have it always on, they would have Time Warner Cable would have these HFC network, which is the long haul is through fiber, which was very clean, and they spent probably 10 to 15 years laying down these fibers. And on the last mile, they would have these coax cable that come into people's home, mainly for TV, because the coax could actually carry a lot of frequencies and so on. So what they've done is they try to dedicate a frequency for your downstream network. And what they've done was they slowly graduate converting these network to have an upstream bandwidth. And that is why, when you're talking about both DSL and cable modem, you're talking about asynchronous speed. Your download speed usually is a little different than your upload speed. And that's the difference. Most of these, I would say both, I'm not as familiar with DSL, but I would say both the DSL and the cable network were meant for a downstream traffic to carry over signals that way. And then, because of the need for the internet, they start upgrading the upstream. And so what I was doing was gradually converting these node by node. What they call node by node, it's like each node governs like 500 homes passed and so on. These go into some different calculation. So it's a little different than that. It's when we're doing these for the residents. So we would go to like these node and we'll certify them and say now it's internet ready. So people could go out and sign up for broadband for their $29.99 per month on the cable broadband. And we're doing that node by node. So as a young engineer, it was really great exposure, because when I arrived at the market I was at, I think there was like 40 people who was like internal employees who were just trialing this network. But by the time I left 2.5 years later, I think it was like 24,000 users or something like that. So you kind of get that exposure, and it's something that you don't really get to do very often, is to launch a market and see that growth period going up. So it's much lower than a data center, a bit different than what I've done later on when I was with the public cloud provider. And that is exactly what you were talking about. Those data centers are just rows and rows of servers. You're worrying about connecting them most efficiently, and how to do. The question becomes how to does the server talk to those servers most efficiently, as well as how does the server talk to the end client in a more, I guess, cost efficient way.
So were you like the cable guy's cable guy?
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. So the cable guy were probably in terms of like connecting you, and I was in the back end connecting all the core together. But in order to do my job, you don't necessarily have to, but I do go out with the cable installers to see how they actually install the wires, how they clamp it, what are some of the interferences. That was the biggest thing for us, is these interferences. When in the traditional network, when it's all just from your head end going down to each of your customers, you're able to control the source to be really, really clean without interference into each of the residential customers. And but when you start talking about like upstream, which was the signal comes from the customer back into the head end, and you could just kind of guess, it's kind of like a reverse funnel. Like all these signals will be coming back. If you turn on the microwave, those are some interference that comes back. If you like turn on your vacuum even, right, those are interference. So if you have a piece of cable or fiber, for example, that is damaged, that actually aggregates back. And because you're oversubscribing bunch of customer to one node, that one node, when it goes down, it impacts all 500 customers. And if you trace back large enough, it's going to impact a lot more people. So anyways, I guess my point is that it's kind of an interesting world that I was in, and it gave me the kind of exposure that I would not otherwise have. Of course, it wasn't all unicorns and rainbows. It was very harsh. Like people were banging on the door trying to get internet, and you just have to turn them away, which was, I guess, a good problem to have. But at the same time, it was a problem nonetheless. We couldn't build it fast enough for our customers.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of things being hard and stressful, I mean, and then once they're hooked up, it better work 100% all the time, or else they're going to be banging down your door saying like, why is it down?
100%, right? And also at the time, the triple play was huge at the time, which was, you get your TV, internet, and phone services from your cable provider. And in order to do that, you get into the whole other territory, like your 911 calls, your emergency battery backup. What if the power goes out, right? The phone, for those people who doesn't know, the phone, you're supposed to still work. Not the wireless one that you require a plug into power, but the ones that are those old handhelds that even if you don't have power, you're supposed to be able to plug in your phone jack, and you should still be able to dial 911 regardless of whether you have the phone service or not, right? You could be in an abandoned building and you should still be able to dial 911, which was these kind of requirements. So as a cable company, it's great to have the business, but at the same time, you're under a different set of rules and regulations in order for you to offer that third triple play service. So so what you talk about as uptime and people's expectation, luckily for us at the time, they were so happy to have a broadband internet. I was able to have a maintenance window, and which was like, I think for me at the time was between 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So any outage that happened within that window, it doesn't count toward our service level agreement. So in other words, we don't have to pay refunds, for customers. But it's a different world now. You imagine now you tell people that, hey, at any given time, your internet may be out for 3 hours and we're not going to do anything about it. That's just not going to fly. But back then it was okay to have, kind of people's expectation were different back then.
Well, it's so interesting, the idea of expectations and things being serious and difficult more generally. I mean, I imagine one of the things that must be kind of frustrating sometimes being an engineer is that like everybody respects doctors because they know what doctors do. They have at least an idea of what doctors do, right? They don't understand the details, but it's like, I'm hurt, you fix me. Everyone knows what teachers do. But when you come to things, particularly when it comes to things like computers and computer networks and things like that, people are like, it just works. And it's like, that duck is paddling really hard under the water there. And that duck really knows their stuff. And I just want to bring it up in that context to say, because you brought up these Cisco certifications and things like that earlier, those things are incredibly hard. You have to learn a great deal, and you have to be tested very rigorously, precisely for the kinds of reasons that you're bringing up. It's not just, as it were, just customer expectations, although at scale you're talking about whole populations of people. It's 911 networks, like that better work. If the power goes down, that better work. And the people who are setting these things up, designing them in the first place, the people who diagnose and maintain them, and the people who are brought in to kind of like, well, how do I know where a fault is, somewhere between point A and point B? These kinds of things are like not just really hard in themselves, but to do under pressure and to be hardened. And that's a lot of the work. So I just wanted to make sure that people listening who aren't aware that, like, it's not like just getting a Cisco certification. This is very, very, very difficult thing to do.
I appreciate being appreciated. But back to, like the episode with Nick, right? So Nick came from a military background. So what you guys talked about, I feel like Nick should pay me some commission for, he's a friend, but commission for mentioning his podcast episode so much. But anyways, he came from a military background. And what he talked about was, when you have nothing, like you need to drop into the desert and provide connectivity for these soldiers to have secure communication back home to both their family as well as to their colleagues, and, receiving intelligent information, not being intercepted by the enemies and so on. So those are different areas, as you mentioned, right? Like that's a different level of service level or security requirements and all of that. And you're right, as far as the Cisco certification, and it's the same for a lot of vendor certifications. It's like the degree of difficulty goes incrementally. So at the time when I was going for, they call the expert level exam, it actually took me 5 years, and I had to go learn a bunch of stuff. I had to go sit in front of a lab that they provided, and for 8 hours to prove that you're able to solve anything that throw at you. So, and then at the end, they give you a number and say you're now, if you pass, right? Like they give you a number, and now you're, so my number was 22460, and supposedly that number is never going to be given to anybody else. That goes to the grave with me. So that's kind of like the effort that you have to put in order to achieve that certification. And and you probably use, like anything else, you use like a fraction of it in real life, but hopefully that fraction is something that you studied before, and if not, then you learn on the job.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for sharing that. It's super interesting, actually. It leads me to ask about the sort of next stage of your career, as it were, I guess. Sure. It was also one where you experienced this great growth, which was at Amazon and AWS. I believe you started working there in 2006, which is forever ago in terms of AWS terms.
Right.
And I was just wondering, for people who are like familiar with this and might want to hear a little bit about what it was like on the inside, can you talk a little bit about just what it was like being in that environment for those years?
Yeah. So it was very interesting. So I want to say I was very lucky to be able to, ride that first wave, which was the broadband wave. If you think back at 2001 timeframe, was during the dot-com bubble, where the bubble burst, but I was still lucky enough to have a job because I was in the growth area, highly growth area within Time Warner. And again, in 2006, and I stayed at the AWS and Amazon company during the financial crisis, right? So that was the second crisis, and I was still lucky to have a job because I was in such a high growth market. So it's no merit by myself. It was just basically be at the right time at the right place at the right time. But yeah, you're right. So 2006 was when I joined Amazon. It was very much a retail store. It was very much a retail business, right? You get your 3% margin, and they're very cost conscious on that front. And if I remember correctly, they barely got out of the .com fiasco, basically. And I think our fierce leader at the time, Jeff Bezos, he was hurt so much by that. He rarely gave interviews after he was being named Time Person of the Year in, I think it was 2000. So it was very much a retail low margin mindset. And then they launched this small service called S3 back in 2006, like March of 2006. I joined August of 2006, but it never really took up until the year after, which they start offering EC2, which was like a virtual machine. Basically, you rent their compute power, and it just took off by then. And we knew we had something special, but we also knew it was so young and so fragile that if you don't take care of it, it's just going to die in its infancy. So I think a lot of us back then were on this mission of bringing cloud computing, which was the term that later coined, but bring utility computing, cloud computing to the world. And we were just it was a very exciting time, but it was also working really hard, and none of us knew what we were doing. And we were given a lot of leeways to do a lot of stuff that we haven't tried before. Like for myself, I was part of the original team to launch CloudFront, which was a super great exposure to be able to survey around the world and see which area should we go next. And it's something that's again growing business from the ground up. So those are the area that gave me great exposure. And being a founder yourself, going from 0 to 1, it's super difficult, just as from 1 to scaling up.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just before we started this interview, I was listening to one of your podcasts, and you talked about going to an all hands meeting at Amazon around that time when Jeff Bezos made this comment. And I'm really glad you actually teed up this question, because I was trying to find a way to ask it. But
Sure.
About the vulnerability, right? That and the sense of kind of like caring for something new and the sort of threat of low margins.
Yeah.
And this is, by the way, none of this is to praise Jeff Bezos or Amazon in any particular way, but like that company, like it is what it is now because it went through a great deal. And one of the things that Jeff Bezos said at this meeting that you attended was good intentions. I think it was like something like good intentions.
Yeah, good intentions don't work.
Don't work, right?
Yeah,
right. I was actually going to say good intentions don't matter, and that was even me being uncharitable by instinct, which is why I was kind of checking myself before. But like,
sure,
good intentions don't work. I mean,
right.
how do you get through what Amazon went through? I mean, like, having a little bit of a background in finance myself, like years of unprofitability, especially when you're a public company, doing what an extraordinary thing, right? Which is like, we're going to lose money for years. Trust me.
That's a hard pill to swallow for investors, for sure.
Well, and then he really did have to prove it, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, like everybody who worked there had to prove it, right? And so what does, in your view, what does good intentions don't matter mean? Don't matter. I did it again. Good intentions don't work mean.
So I think I was with so just to give a little context for people who did not listen to that episode. So I was in this group called Tier 1 Services, and our group was main responsibility to make sure the website stays up, and when it goes down, we contact the right group to fix it. So we, just like a lot of companies that, the services are classified into Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and what classifies Tier 1 is usually things that when they break, you don't make money. Right? So like networking, for example, if the network breaks, you don't make money. So it's very crucial. And that's a question that was always on our mind, like as a team, and was a brand new team too. It was like, I think I was maybe one of the first engineers that was hired into, one of the first network engineers that was hired into the group. So things that at the time, to put background information, I've was really thinking about what does it mean to be a network engineer in a Tier 1 service, and how do we monitor the network? How do we scale monitoring to a point where, people still have a quality of life, reasonable life, but at the same time, we could still keep a certain SLA going. So when I attended that meeting, that was kind of the questions always in my mind. And when Jeff came out on the stage and said, good intentions don't work, and he took his time to explain why good intentions don't work, right? People have good intention, but when it's 3 a.m. in the morning, you're tired, you're not thinking right. Or if it's, like Friday night that you have something else that you want to attend to, that, human nature prompts you to take shortcuts, or human nature prompts you to trying to fix things as soon as possible so you could get onto it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just human nature. So what he ended up saying was, what works is a system and automation that works. And so you want to rely the computer to solve your own problem about, human nature being, we're tired, we're not consistent. When we try to do things for the thousandth time, we tend to make mistakes. So what works is really you offload those stuff to automation, to computer assisted work, and you free yourself up into the higher level of tasks that's meant for human brain, such as designing your network the correct way. So with that in mind, that kind of just hit me really hard at that moment. It's like you could almost go back to several moments in your career where you're like, oh my God, that was, looking back, that was the moment that hit you. And so for me, even if I talk about, learning Python, writing books on Python or Kafka, all these other technology stuff, right? These are just tactical stuff. Fundamentally, that changed my mindset about which direction I should go on, what actually works. So back to your question, he said, good intentions don't work. So what really works are automation, that you want to, realizing your own shortcomings as human beings, and find the right tools and the strategy to help you solve those problems.
Which actually is another great segue that you provided me with, or opportunity for a segue. Thank you there, which is to your first book, which you published with Pact, which was about automation.
Sure.
It's called, for those who aren't aware, it's called Mastering Python Networking, your one-stop solution to using Python for network automation, programmability, and DevOps. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, if you could kind of maybe talk at the same time about what you mean when you're talking about automation there with Python and things like that, and how that really changes, like how that's a part of your journey as a network engineer into like learning how to scale through automation and things like that, and sort of maybe tell the story of how the book came about at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for asking that question. So I think in order to know the kind of reason of writing that book, you go back to the days of Amazon, you're growing super fast, you're barely keeping up. Like I said, it wasn't always rainbows and unicorns, right? We were dying. We were just like, we couldn't meet the demand fast enough. And with the amount of projection that we're saying, we need X amount of servers, we need X amount of data centers, and everybody was racing toward that goal. I think Andy Jassy, who's now the CEO for Amazon, at the time, he was the head of AWS, in a very young, AWS org. He said, when elastic computing become inelastic, that's when the industry would die, right? So your whole premise, built on that. When somebody pays the credit card and turns on that S3 bucket, that S3 bucket's got to be there, right? Or the EC2 instance, it's got to launch. So your elasticity depends on a solid backend that meets your peak demand, and that peak demand is a shifting target, and that shift is dramatically different than what I've always used to. Talk about Time Warner Cable. That projection was very linear. At a certain time you do what, and then that'll get you over the next hump. And your resources, you could plan ahead. If you're digging up some trenches, you got to go apply for the government. That's 3 months of paperwork. But it's very different with Amazon. So the scale was just on a different scale at all. So networking wise, that becomes a very big challenge in order to provision to there's some stuff that you cannot automate, right? Rack and stack. You got to physically put the box there. You got to physically connect these cables. But if you think about provisioning, if you think about, okay, now the racks are there, now I need to connect these boxes together, provision the servers, the VLANs, the port speeds, and all of that, those could be automated. So that is when you really, in order to survive that kind of a growth, you have to be able to use computers again to manage these boxes. And unfortunately, at the time, the mindset of the networking industry was much more geared toward a human managed network. And so the devices fundamentally are not automation friendly. So, so now you have these contradicting priorities, right? The vendors would give you one set of things, expecting a human on the other end to manage it. But at the same time, you need to be able to manage these boxes automatically, at least once once the standard has been provisioned, and now you're just kind of rubber stamping on the same nodes across. So that is where I started to think about, or for survivability, really, how do we do this, right? How do we provision so much of these devices in such a short amount of time with the amount of people that we have? And that is the kind of the path and the growing pain that me and a bunch of other engineers went through within Amazon, and also to other org as well, right? You talk about Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft, all these other companies who needs to provision the servers fast enough for the network. So I went through a period of time thinking about that, and eventually, I don't want to say we solved that problem, but at least we have a fighting chance of solving that problem with Python and with some of the newer packages and so on. So after a few years of doing that, I looked around, and of course there was no resources back then to learn from. So I made a lot of mistakes. We made a lot of mistakes. I poke myself in the eye constantly. And so a couple of years later, and I started writing blog posts, right? Like about, these bits and pieces that I've learned along the way. And I started thinking about what I would, if I know what I know now, what would I tell myself, younger self, when I was just starting out? Because I see a lot of other engineers trying to come down the same path and essentially making the same mistake that I made, or in the same boat of being confused and not knowing what's the scope, why we're even doing it. So that was my persona. I was writing that book for my younger self and say, it's okay. Don't panic. And here are the stuff that I wish I had known, and put into a book format. And the second question was, how did the book came about? So like I said, I started writing blog posts, and these are just bits and pieces. These are notes for myself, really. I took a lot of notes, and I convert some of those notes that I think are useful for others. And at the time, I think one of my blog posts about OpenFlow, which is at the time was a newer technology and not a lot of resources out there, started ranking pretty high on Google search. If you do like OpenFlow for POX controller, I think it ranked pretty high, and that got the notice of some editors at PACT, and they reached out, and kind of the rest is history.
Yeah, and was it very exciting to get approached by a publishing company? I don't want to talk. We normally talk about that kind of stuff mostly at the end, but and that's what we'll do in this interview as well. But it must have been sort of exciting to be approached by a publishing company and asked to write a book.
It was exciting, but it was also I didn't think that they knew what they were talking about. So I think when you talk about Python networking, you're typically talking about like sockets and like servers and like little protocols within like Linux kernel about networking versus network management. So I had to go a double take and say, are you sure this is what you were talking about? And this is what you want me to write a book about? Because that's all I know. And they say, yeah, that's fine. They confirm it a couple of times. And then I start saying, okay, great. I didn't know about LeanPub back then, but I would have like probably still write a self-published book, even if they hadn't approached me, because that's just something I wanted to do. But, great. Now PAC was willing to give me a chance to do it. So I wrote the book really, really fast before they realized they made a mistake. So, so that's what it was.
And so you'd been writing blog posts, and then you published this book. And was that around the time that you started to make courses and things like that and become kind of a content creator on, at least, I'm going to say on the side, but because you have always had a job the whole time, but you do have, like, you do make books and courses and blog posts and podcasts now as well. Was there a point in time when you decided that this would be like a big part of your non 9-to-5 life?
Yeah. So, I want to give credit to Michael Kennedy as well as his podcast on Talk Python. So of course, during the time I was learning Python, I was trying to look for resources on Python itself. And his podcast was a great influence on me. And at the time, I believe he actually recommended 2 books. If I remember these titles correctly, one is called A Company of One. And the other was The End of Jobs. And so both of these books, basically the gist of these books were, you are your own company. You want to treat your career as if you're a startup of one. You want to take care of your you want to market your skills and think of yourself as a marketing, right? So where's your demand? Who's paying you to do what, right? Like what your skill set fits somebody who would pay you to do, right? Like I may love eating pizza, but nobody's going to pay to watch me eat pizza. So you want to find these circles, and then once you find that overlap, you want to spend all of your time working on that part, because that's the part where it's most valuable to people. So after listening to that, I thought to myself about where I want to take my career. At the time I had a young family. I just, whether my first kid was born or my second kid, I can't recall. But anyway, so that got me to think about where I want to go. I still need that job, but also I want to take advantage of the opportunity to generate side income, and treating my career as if it's a startup. So I want to know where is my most valuable skill set, and where's the market demand for that, and so on and so forth. So that is when I started to, you're right, that was around 2016, 2017. 2017 was when the book came out, but 2016 is when I started making courses and trying to find that unfulfilled demand out there. And that in itself is a kind of goes back to what finance and business degree would taught you, right? Like you want to find a demand that is unfulfilled and large enough to sustain a couple of players in it, and so on. And that was kind of the trigger, and that continued on to today, where I enjoy making content. And but as you know, right, like making content is great and all, but it's hard to scale because you're really just depending on yourself. So that's what I see as the next challenge is, how do we make user-generated content beneficial and have the kind of influence that it deserves. So anyway, so that's some question I have, and that's why LeanPub is such a great platform. And I was actually surprised to hear that it's been around for 10 years. I mean, you must have a great story to tell, and I'm looking forward to listening to your. I listened to several episodes, but not all of them. But I look forward to listening to your story, how you came up, and all the challenges that you solve.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for sharing all of that, and for the kind words about LeanPub at the end. I mean, obviously enabling kind of content creators like yourself to kind of do things efficiently in a way that reach an audience that scales. That's kind of like, that's what we're all about, is trying to help people do that. It's funny, actually, the file number on the recording for this episode is 200. So this is
nice.
the 200th recorded episode. And I nice just bring it up because I've been thinking about doing a kind of like just solo, what is LeanPub kind of episode, where maybe I would just talk for 45 minutes or an hour about, what is LeanPub, what's it, how long has it been around, all that kind of stuff, and what have been some of the challenges over the years.
Forget my episode. I'm looking forward to that episode. Yeah. Like, put that into 200. I'll be like, 201, 215. Yeah. I don't care, but I want to listen to that one.
Yeah, the fun. I'm not going to go off about that too much, but yeah, the fun parts will be like the things you kind of, when you've been around that long, the things you stop noticing. You stop noticing that they're not happening anymore. Like people going, why would I buy a book that's not finished? Like, of course, when we launched, we got that all the time because like, LeanPub books weren't just unfinished in the sense of like serial novels that are published chapter by chapter. They were like unfinished nonfiction books that are published after someone's finished 3 chapters, and by the way, they're probably going to be revising chapter 1 every time they go back in. And so like even something you read is now going to be changed, and that was a strange idea, but knock on wood, we basically don't get that anymore.
Right.
And so that's one of the features of being around for a while like that, is that like people don't, if you're doing something that's like, insofar as LeanPub's innovative, like in a sort of fundamental way when it comes to publishing. I mean, that has to also to do with, I mean, back to that business mindset, right? Like if you treat your skill set as a quote unquote company of one, you want to do the proof of concept, you want to have a lean process that's advertised by was it Eric Rice with his book of Eric Ries's first LeanPub book was Startup Lessons Learned, which was turning Eric Ries's blog into a book.
So for sure, right? Like, so yeah, everything that you just said really resonates, and I'm glad that you don't like people start to have that buy-in, right? Like they could drive the direction of the finished product, if you're able to just show it to people and put it in front of people so that they know where the demand meets the skill set.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's just, I mean, to talk about that for a moment as well. One of the things we always used to say is, one of the biggest successes we can give an author is proof they should stop writing their book.
Yeah.
Because in the olden in the as were the olden days, sort of, if you sort of have this sort of cartoonish image of how a book is written, right? It's like you get a contract with a publisher, then you go live in a cabin in Norway for 3 years, right, working on your magnum opus. And then you give it to the publisher, and 2 years later, it makes it through their process and it comes out, and then no one wants it.
Right.
And if
that's a tragedy.
That's if you were on a mission, if you meant it, if it was valuable in itself to you to go through that and write that and have it out there, and maybe someone will discover it in 100 years, or maybe they never will. That's time very well spent. But if your goal was to get an audience for your work and for yourself, perhaps, or for your cause that you're advocating, to find out 5 years later what you could have found out if you just published 2 chapters in, that no one's interested in a book on the subject, then you just saved that person, 4.8 years,
Yeah, and then he could work on his next masterpiece, right? So
yeah,
I think absolutely, right? Like if your goal is just to write something that pleases yourself, and that's something down the line, of course. But I think the majority of our work, we want to see that reach, and we want to be able to, be the change that we want to be. So, and oftentimes for authors, that's through their writing. And if nobody reads it, then, what are the chances of you accomplishing your goal?
Yeah, it's interesting. The old example funny example I used to give was to show how complicated it is, like deciding what to write about, when it's something, if you like writing and you like teaching people, specifically with respect to kind of prescriptive nonfiction, which is mostly in pub books, which is, teaching you how to do stuff basically, or explaining things. If you really like a subject and you really want to write about it and share it with people, even you still have to make a choice about what to do first, right? And so, for example, you might write the expert's guide to model train sets, and you publish it and no one's interested. But if you'd started writing the beginner's guide to model train set, the intermediate guide to model train set, and the expert's guide to model train sets, and you started writing all 3 at the same time, published each one when it's 3 chapters in, and you noticed no one was interested in the expert's guide, but there was a ton of people interested in the beginner's guide, right? Well, now you know which project to work on, and when it's done, guess what next project you're going to work on? All these people have finished the beginner's guide; they're going to want the intermediate guide, right? So it's actually like publishing as you go with projects has these many kind of deep kind of benefits, including abandoning projects. And that's for sure. Some of the stuff that we've learned over the years that was a bit unexpected. But speaking,
I'm not ashamed to tell you that the first book I started with Lean Pub was many years ago, and I think and like what you said, I actually was speaking at DevNet Create for one of the Cisco events, and actually before the event it was on Elastic Stack. So and the talk was on Elastic, and before the event, I kind of advertised the book and so on, and I sold a total of 1 copy. So I know that's not, probably I either shift my focus into like a more useful way for people, or I just kind of bend in that. So Kafka book really wasn't my first encounter with Lean Pub, but that was still very useful information, even just to pick the right project to work on. And I do put my money where my mouth is, right? Like as soon as I made enough, I went back and got a lifelong membership with Lean Pub. So I am for better or for worse, man, I'm counting on the platform to be around for 10 and 20 years.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that. And actually, just so people know, so we do have we have a freemium model. So you can there's a free plan, so you can do lots and lots of things, awesome things as a self-published author. But there are some things that require maintenance and things on our side. So we do have paid, standard, and pro plans. And what Eric's talking about is it's actually like it's a form of thing that we actually are very glad to be able to provide to people, which is if one of the other values, or one of the other things of value that can come from publishing in progress, is that your book project can become self-funding. Mm-hmm. So if your book starts making some money, then you can use that to pay for, a week off to work on the book, take a little leave from work, or you can use it to pay for advertising for your book if you want to do that. And like, if you can set up a good self-funded advertising model for your book, well, now you've just got something that takes off on its own, tie it in a bow, as it were, and off you go. And you can also, of course, if you're on one of our monthly plans, we have lifetime plans, so you just don't have to worry about the monthly payments anymore. And like a lot of authors who have our lifetime plans, is exactly that. They're like, this one's working out, I guess I'll use my proceeds to get a lifetime plan, and now I don't have to worry about that anymore, and I can just work on as many Leanpub projects as I want, using all the features, and away you go.
Something that I think it's both true in self-publishing as well as open source project is the issue of sustainability, right? Like what you were talking about. These are a lot of the technologies we work on are open sourced or started in open source, and kind of be the result of a lot of volunteers volunteer their time, effort, and energy into this project. But the issue becomes the sustainability. Who's paying for these if there are no costs to do this? And same thing for content creators is how do you sustain your operations? And back to what we were talking about Leanpub, a traditional publisher, since I've worked with, I've also worked with O'Reilly and all these other publishers that produce on a smaller scale, but their aim is a little different, right? Their overhead structure is different. They have to have their motto is to have certain, like 1% or 5% of the books that's profitable enough to make up for the rest of the book that does not make money, which results in a smaller percentage of royalty for the authors that do end up in that 1%. And whatever pros and cons for that model, what ends up being is it's hard to sustain a writing career if you're only getting 16-20% or up to 25% of the royalty that the books makes. However, if you're able to use a lower overhead platform and still get even just a fraction of the sales figure, first of all, you're able to write on topics that may not gear toward the general public, and very much service toward that long tail, but at the same time you're be able to sustain your project. So I think those are two big issues that I see right now in open source community as well as content creators, is just this sustainability. Like you'll see hyper successful companies like Anaconda, which is a Python package company for data science, that they're uber successful. They're the company, but they still have to go on and do Series A, Series B, Series C funding that just to sustain their operation and still contribute back to the open source community. And if they have to do that, think about the 10,000 other companies that are doing similar stuff but doesn't have the recognition or visibility of Anaconda. So it's not a problem that we could solve right away, but what you're doing and what Leanpub is doing is being part of the solution.
That's a very good description of how a lot of, particularly the publishing industry, works, right? Like, because if you're a conventional publishing company, I mean, somewhat infamously, typical publishers tend to be spending less and less on advances and things like that, and less and less on marketing and stuff like that. And it's a big problem, right? Because for them to attract authors, because if you're not giving them a high royalty rate, like if you're giving them a low royalty rate, and then one of the things that happens, because specifically for what you're saying, like only a small proportion of the books that a publishing company publishes are profitable and can make up for all the investments in both those books and all the other books that they've had to invest in. What happens is that, like, if your first book ends up kind of in the remainder section of the bookstore,
not doing too hot,
you're not going to have a very good chance of getting a second contract. I mean, I'm sort of like speaking at a very kind of abstract level here. Like, I mean, keep going, don't give up. You know what I mean? But but still, like, and like notoriously too, there you can like sort of be really excited. My first book is out, but if the guy sitting next to you, his book is doing better just in that first week, guess who's going to get the next week's marketing budget? You know what I mean? And now your book dies, but maybe if just there'd been a different news article out that week on your subject, yours would have been the one that made it beat the other one in the first week, and you would have got the company's marketing budget going forward. And so it's very, I mean, like, all things in life are risk, and there's precariousness and sort of luck and bad luck and things like that. But
you lose out a lot of gems, right? Like, so I think if you think back on the uber successful comic of Seinfeld, the first 3 seasons were just like, they're going nowhere, right? I don't know if you're familiar with that show, but it's like, I think they had a very successful run, and it's a US based show, so you may not know. but the first 3 seasons, they got nowhere, and all of a sudden the fourth one, starting from the 4th season, if I remember correctly, it just exploded and it became one of the most successful shows, sitcoms ever. But the thing is, if you give up on the first 3 seasons, or you never get discovered, like the 4th season was never made, you generally lose out on this excellent show, and you lose out on the stuff that would benefit a large chunk of people. So like what you were saying is that if you don't, like, the cycle, that the chance of being discovered is shorter and shorter, people's attention spans are shorter and shorter, so there's finite amount of money in order to get your product being noticed. And it's hard to stay in the game if you're not successful right away. I think that's what you're driving at too. But we don't want that.
Yeah, well, no, that's if your success is contingent on the efforts of your publishing company promoting your book, then you're exposed in these ways. And you brought up the other thing too, which is that with self-publishing, you typically make much higher royalty rates, which actually make some projects sustainable just in themselves that wouldn't be otherwise. For example, I bet Nick Russo would not have found a conventional book publisher to sell his 1 million word $400
the
Cisco
study guide
book,
for
right?
Cisco,
but it's
SP. Yeah.
But that book, for from the author's perspective, to make it worth his time and a sustainable thing, he didn't need to reach 1 million people. I wish he had, but but he didn't need to. And there are lots of, I'm sort of saying it in a joking way, there are books that exist because of self-publishing that wouldn't have existed otherwise, and they met all 300 experts in that area in the world. Now have an excellent book. The market is 100% saturated. 300 copies were sold, but it's an excellent book that wouldn't have existed otherwise, and the authors now can pay for their kids' college or something like that. These are the great successes that come from having these different kinds of models. And just speaking of things that you experience over the years, particularly at Lean Pub, is there's still a sort of we're still using the word still, one thing that hasn't changed about a certain kind of negativity that some people will have when it comes to self-publishing books. But when you've discovered the fact that you can actually pay for your own time to write that book you always wanted to write, and have everyone in the world who cares about that issue learn about it and thank you for the book, your attitude towards it starts to change, and you stop worrying so much about, like, oh, what does this say about my social status that I self-published a book? You know what I mean? Like, you start asking more serious, when it's kind of funny, but like when it becomes truly possible to do it well, self-publish, you stop worrying, so you start thinking about what you can accomplish rather than what people are going to think, if you know what I mean.
I agree 100%. It's really about freedom. And, working with traditional publisher, like you said, they really worry about, the first goal is to sell books. So they want to capture as big of a base as possible. So you're talking about, like SEO ranking, you're talking about most likely beginner books, right? Like, there's only so much experts or intermediate who are interested in a topic, but the base is like a pyramid. The base, introductory books usually capture the most potential readers. So that, if you realize that part, it's really sometimes not in sync with the author's objective. From the author's objective perspective, they really want to write the book they want to read, and they want to write the book that has the kind of influence that they're looking for. So when there's delta, usually in a traditional sense, the publisher wins, right? That you're bending your original goal into including this chapter that might not have otherwise made it into it, or you made every chapter 6,000 words instead of 3,000 because whatever. So I think it's really about freedom that it provides people about for authors that like you said, you don't need to worry about all these other stuff. You just focus on what you want to write, and if both the readers are very happy and you're good with it, then so be it. And prior to Leanpub, I don't think there's anything that was available. Of course, create space and all that, but that's another story.
Well, actually, that's actually a really interesting thing to bring up in the context as well, because particularly in the print book world, actually, the kind of trend is, in a very good way, has been not exactly the opposite from what I was describing, but basically because print on demand is how books are produced now.
Yeah,
the sort of like what they used to call the mid list or backlist books, you know what I mean? Like the books that the company's not promoting anymore because they're 10 years old. A book could be 20 years old. It may not have sold a copy in 20 years, but then for whatever reason, the subject that the book is about just starts trending. And everybody just goes onto Amazon,
right,
and clicks a button, and then there's some like a bunch of automated messages get sent back and forth. And there's a machine somewhere printing that book off now.
Exactly.
And the reason that's revolutionary is because in the past you could only make money by printing a big,
inventory of books.
Big inventory of books, right? And then if someone ordered them, you'd be like, thank God I can get one of those out the door.
Right.
But now that they're being printed when they're being ordered, and you can do that profitably, it means any book that has been written and is existing in a digital file somewhere can have its printing triggered by you on your phone. And so that's actually made a lot of books profitable in a way now that they've at least they're generating some royalties for their authors in a way that they absolutely wouldn't have in the past.
I agree. Yeah. So I think so I was actually with the fulfillment center branch within Amazon when they acquired CreateSpace, as well as the other company. I forgot the name, but for CreateSpace for books, right? But the other company for digital media, like movies and pressing DVDs. So they were very much on demand as well. So you kind of think of movies, DVDs, as if when they release it, they make a bunch of discs, and maybe that's true for the first run. But afterwards, Braveheart, for example, right, 1995, and if somebody wants to buy a DVD of Braveheart, it's not like there's this they dust off from the shelf on some old warehouse and ship it to you. It's a digital file that's stored somewhere, and now it's like, oh well, great Braveheart, we'll just make a disc right there and then ship it to Eric. And so that allows, like you said, like a lot of the long tail people who were might not be served be able to just make it a possibility. So you're right, print on demand is really revolutionary, and it's great.
And I was slyly hoping there to find a way into talking about your book, Kafka Up and Running for Network DevOps. And I was trying to do it by setting the idea that like messages are being sent back and forth between what you might call producers and consumers, but these are all machines. And so I was wondering if you could just take a few moments to talk about the book and what Kafka is.
Yeah, sure. So Kafka is really just a messaging system. So if you think about the use cases of Kafka, we have a lot of databases and storage options, like your large scale, whether it's SQL, NoSQL database. We have a lot of options when you need to write a record persistent somewhere and then retrieve it later, right? You write it, like you're signing up a library card or you do your driver license, you fill out your information, it's stored in the database somewhere, and when you need it, you retrieve it. But what we're lacking is the system where we're treating data as in something about data in motion. That's something that data comes in and it's only stored temporarily in the storage capacity until we could enrich that data and we influence that data and kind of transport it. So for example, in a network security sense, for example, that's when I first started to think about treating data as in data is this moving, always morphing subject, right? So we would have, say a log somewhere, and then we will have an IP address. And in the log itself, and in IP address is not very meaningful. So what we need to do is we put the IP address into a place where we could create a IP database table or database that we know this IP address is from Russia and is from the company of, I don't know, Russia Telecom, for example. And then we feed it into the Kafka topic, and the Kafka subscriber receive that information, and it would say, okay, Now we're correlating that IP address with other information that we may have. Maybe it's, we have a list of botnets, we have a list of vulnerable IPs, and we could match up and whether that's the hit or miss. And now that's a second topic for publishers and subscribers. Then we could publish it to the third place where we could store it into a place where we could visualize and we could have aggregated into a map and so on and so forth. So if you do that enough, then you have a more aggregated view. But the point is, if you need to write that data, you need to write that log entry into a database, retrieve it, enrich it, and then write it to a database again, and then retrieve it. So like that pattern is very different than my use case of always treating the data as in the stream of flowing data. So that's essentially what the problem Kafka is trying to solve, is trying to treat data as in data in motion. And you're always trying to get data, retrieve data, and then it become a permanent storage at the very end.
Yeah, and just to give people, I hope I'm going to try and come up with a concrete example of this.
For sure.
Based on some of the research I did from your YouTube interviews and stuff that I've seen. But let's see if I can sort of bring all this down to collapse it down to a very specific example, which is Netflix and when you pause Netflix.
Yeah,
Netflix uses Kafka, I think, and that pausing is a topic in Kafka parlance, right? Like that.
Right.
That it's not like sort of storing the whole movie paused in that state somewhere. It's kind of writing a quote unquote topic that like here's basically a sort of like pointer to where in that movie you want to go if the person clicks play again.
Right. And if you're like me, I'm always sampling different movies. So there's like within the span of 30 minutes, I might be looking at movie A, pausing it, and then looking at movie B, pausing it and go, oh no, let me go back to movie A and I'll watch it for 5 more minutes. And then I'll stop. And then I'll go back to my, maybe I'm doing on my TV, and then I'll go back to my treadmill. I want to continue on my iPad, and then I have to do that again. So those are the kind of stuff that, Netflix is using Kafka perhaps to store those temporary information. And those, like my first pause for movie A, that is only meaningful until I resume it on movie B. Then that information is no longer useful for anybody, right? Like I don't care that on Sunday night 7 p.m. I pause it at 5:42. All I care is my latest progress for movie A is hour and a half into that movie, and I want that to be transparent to all of the devices, right? Whether it's on my phone, my iPad, and so on. So those are the kind of problem that Kafka would solve. And just that technology in general. It's not for everything, and it's not for, so back to what we're talking about. It's so interesting, Len, right? Like everything goes back into what we're talking about. I knew this book would not be as popular as Mastering Python Networking, or I knew this topic wouldn't be useful for everybody, especially in the network engineering community. If most people are still learning about automation, they don't really worry about data. They don't really worry about, just like I didn't worry about it in the beginning. But I wanted to write this book, right? God, I don't care if 2 people read this book. I wanted to have this book out there so that it could serve a purpose. It could serve people who does need it. It's like I forgot who said this, right? But it's like, do you want to write a book that's like a vitamin, or do you want to write a book that's like a painkiller, right? So when you're in pain, you're like, oh my God, I want that painkiller. This is the exact book that I want to, it will solve my problem tomorrow. I'd be a superstar at work. Versus it's like, oh, it's a nice to have. It's like, oh, I wanted to learn about automation at some point, and I'll just buy this book. I eat this vitamin. It's good for me. So I look at Kafka as being, okay, I was the one looking for this book in the network engineering context. And I want this book to be that one book that when somebody else needs it, they could be able to download it. And it's only a fraction of the sales figure for the Mastering Python, but I'm happy with it, right? Like, and I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, thanks very much for that image. I've never heard that before, but that perfectly captures so many, like, sort of, my brother and I have this joke that there's an infinite number of ways you can split the world up into 2 kinds of things. And this is when you've given me a new one, which is vitamins and painkillers. Right. That captures it very well. And it captures it very well too from the author's perspective as well, right? Because sometimes people write books for the same reason, right? Like, it'll be good for me. or it'll get rid of this terrible pain that I have to be able to
Right.
just put these thoughts down, and have to like force myself to do it in an orderly, clear way, because then I'll actually be solving my own problem by forcing myself to do that. It's a version of the old line of like, you don't really understand something until you have to teach it. And so by
Precisely.
setting yourself that challenge, like then you'll really understand it.
For
Um,
sure.
the last question
Yeah.
I always like to ask guests on the podcast, if they're LeanPub authors, is if there was one terribly awful broken thing about LeanPub that you could ask us to fix, or if there was one magical feature you could ask us to build for you, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
Um, I can't think of any like glaring thing. I mean, the fact that I bought a lifetime membership, right? Like that means I believe in the system. I believe in enough that, you know, I want to work with this platform long term. But what I would think that it would really help is to right now, in order for me to um, do a more thorough distribution channel, I have to go to somebody else. Just for my use case, I have to go to Publish Drive, which is another startup that pushes it to other marketplaces, such as, you know, what is it, like iBook for Apple Store. You know, they also do Amazon, and they also work with Ingram, so you know you could sell it to foreign companies and so on, and especially if you want like a print version of your book as well. So if I could ask for a pony, I know it's a heavy lift, and it's probably against the idea of lean. So but that's what I would say.
You mean like make a print book and distribute it all
Yeah,
these
make
different
it
channels for
easier
me?
to distribute it, and
Yeah.
maybe market it, buy ads on some other platforms. That's another thing that these other vendor provides, which is, so what I do is, you know, I use LeanPub to write the book and make it in a print ready state, and then I could upload it to somebody else in order for them to make a print copy, as well as you know, buy ads if I wanted to. I didn't, but you know, if I wanted to promote my book more, I'm able to buy ads on such as Amazon platform, maybe Google search, and so on and so forth.
That's really fascinating. This is something we've been asked for, generally speaking, in the past. I mean, very specifically, we have, as Eric's mentioning, we have a print-ready PDF output
Yeah.
export feature. So if you've written
Right.
your book in one of our workflows, you can just click a button, and we give you the PDF. I mean, you set some parameters and stuff, but then
Sure.
you get the PDF file that you need to upload to like Amazon KDP or Lulu or all these other sort of services that can then be print on demand services like we were just talking about.
Yeah.
But more generally speaking, what people are often asking at a more basic level, what they're asking for is like, look, I don't want to have to go to five. My book publishing part of my life is one room in the mansion, and I wish it could just be one room in the mansion. But so I've got the room in the mansion, which is LeanPub, but now I've got to go to three garages, or
Yeah.
what have you, to do the other things I need to do, right?
Right.
And so there is a desire out there for that. And so I've got a very specific question for you on that, actually, if you
Sure.
don't mind.
Yeah.
So
Go for it.
or if you could click a button on LeanPub and we then published it on Amazon
Hmm.
ourselves, which would then have to be under like a LeanPub account or imprint or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we'd have to get some cut of whatever the royalties that came in from that
Yeah.
were. Would that be something you'd want to do, even though you could just go and set yourself up on Amazon independently and get 100% of the Amazon returns from the Amazon sales? Would it be, I'm sure you know what I'm asking. Like,
Yeah.
would it be worth saving your time and the efficiency to just have all of that handled by LeanPub, even though you might have made some more money if you'd done Amazon independently?
Yeah. I don't think so. I know other authors that I've talked to would be useful for them, and they would totally go for that. But for me, it wasn't. I wouldn't do it, and I'll tell you why. It's not so much about the money; it's more about the freedom and the control that I would get. Right. So this book, since it was the first kind of end-to-end finished book for LeanPub, I actually did a lot of experiment. Right. So for people who doesn't know, LeanPub also, once you publish the book, you can also pause selling of the book if it for any reason that requires. So in this case, because I wanted to experiment with Kindle Unlimited and all of that, and they require exclusivity on those, so I could pause the LeanPub, and I could pause the distribution on Publish Drive, so that Kindle becomes the exclusive provider. And I just wanted to see how they come up with like the royalty percentage and all of that. So the added benefit of Kafka, knowing that it might not be as popular of a topic, is I get a lot of freedom to try out these different things. And I did try all these other stuff, right? And give Amazon exclusivity, kind of edit the page within Amazon, get different ISBN numbers from different sources, and including from Amazon itself, assign. So read through all the agreements and all of that. So I think for me, I wouldn't do that because of the control. What I think would, and this is just from experience, right? So most of the books I think selling in the US, probably 50% comes from Amazon. And what I would want in this very specific case is I want to have that A+ page. If you just, if you spend a little bit more time, think about if you have a consulting gig, right? If a customer that's generates 50% of your revenue, you want to be able to treat that customer as a VIP and give it as much, love, tender care as possible, as opposed to all the other ones that you maybe just want to hit the mark as being, pretty good, but you want this VIP customer to feel excellent and be at home. So in this case, because Amazon generates about 50% of all the book sales or more, that I want to be able to take that print ready copy, upload to Amazon, and generate the what they call the A+ page, which means there's more summaries, and you could upload images and give more details on the what the book was about. So that's very purely personal taste, I would say. But I would also think that just from chatting with other authors in the networking industry who also does publishing on LeanPub, is that they would totally go for that. They just wanted a few print copies that they could show their parents, or that they could give out at conferences, on speaking engagements. And so I could see both ways. It's just that for me personally, because I take it more seriously, I wouldn't go down that route.
Yeah, thanks very much for going into so much detail. I really appreciate that. It's one of the reasons we leave these kinds of questions till the end. And by the way, there actually are people who skip to the end. They're like, I don't care about all that other stuff. I want to
is that
about...
right?
Oh yeah,
okay.
No, they're like, is that like what you just described there? Like for someone who's like starting out in self-publishing or something like that, like that's just a golden 3 minutes of insider knowledge that would take so much time to learn about on your own, and to hear about that experience directly, and the various needs and the choices. Like when you're self-publishing, you're making choices all the time,
right.
unless you're not, right, because that's not, because you don't want to be making choices all the time,
right.
but it really does come down to you and your personality and maybe the individual project and stuff like that. For a lot of people, if they're going to be selling on Amazon, they're going to want control over how their books are portrayed and how they're portrayed, in a fine detail. They might be tweaking. There might be some people who want to tweak it every day to see, does this make a difference? Does that make a difference?
Yeah.
And
A/B testing, that would be a killer feature. And so you mentioned people might find it useful, right? So feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I've learned so much just from this one book of self-publishing experience, right? Like who would have known that there's only one company who sell ISBN numbers in the whole of the United States, right? Or, how for example, like how thick of a page it's usually in the print format, so that how many pages does it take in order for you to have like words on the spine, right? So, and less than that page, because of the depth, that it doesn't even make sense to have words on the spine and so on. So if anybody's interested, I've learned so much and I'm happy to share that knowledge. Just reach out to me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, whatever. I'm happy to just bounce off ideas because we're all connected and we should be helping each other out.
Yeah, and if you do ever write a blog post about it or something, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me, and I'll make sure to kind of, the LeanPub accounts will tweet about it and stuff like that, because
awesome.
that kind of thing. I mean, not only would it be obviously inherently valuable in itself, but like it really helps people who are starting out or who are frustrated or who just don't know what, which they've see these two paths before them and don't know which one to take. Hearing about those kinds of personal experiences can really help.
And I mean, not to derail, but I did benefit from a lot of these tribal knowledge as well before. So I was approached by Pact, but I didn't know anything about it, right? Like, is this percentage they give good or bad? Or like, how many copies do I anticipate to get? But there's surprisingly not as many people to write about the publishing experience as I would have imagined. But I did go out there. There'll be like, I don't know, like second or third page of Google search results. Like that's how deep I go, and look for those blog posts. And one for those few that actually publish the numbers, it helped me tremendously to set the expectations right about you're not going to get rich, but if what's considered good, right? Is 90,000 good on Amazon ranking? That is right. Is 1 million good or whatever? So I mean, it really benefited me, and I want to contribute back and be part of the solution in providing people who are confused maybe.
Yeah, well, please, yeah, everybody, please, team Eric means it. He's a very friendly guy online. So, I mean, we've never met, but doing this research, I got a sense of your personality and how open you are and how much you like helping people and stuff like that. Just to close that off on that note, when it comes to like you have to go 3 pages down, when it comes to publishing contracts, one of the really and that whole world, there's this woman named Christine Catherine Rush, Rusch. She's been a guest on the podcast in the past, and her blog is just excellent about that. You'll find her pretty quickly.
Oh, nice.
So if you ever get approached by a publishing company and you're wanting the sort of specific amounts is like that's changing all the time, but the sort of principles of like how should I approach reading a publishing company contract, stuff like that, her blog is really excellent about that.
Awesome. I'll check it out.
Yeah. Well, Eric, thank you very much for taking the time out of beautiful kind of Seattle area evening to talk to all of us here. And thanks very much for using LeanPub as the platform for your latest book.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Len. I mean, I thank you for creating the platform, and I'm a believer, and hopefully I get to work with LeanPub a lot more, and I'm sure I will, and I'll enjoy the whole experience. And thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.